Hi everyone, and welcome here on 99 Media to this new episode of our conversation with Professor Michael Roberts. In today's interview, we will discuss the rationale of Trump's tariff and analyze what seemed to be a gamble aimed both at restructuring the hierarchical relations with the imperial core and impose a decoupling from China. As Professor Roberts highlights during the interview, after a first announcement of blanket tariff pretty much to all countries, including the Penguins government of the Heard Island and McDonald Island, the aim has been narrowed down and the litany we have been hearing on the media is all about China, the supposed boogeyman of the world. In this interview, we will try to debunk such a narrative. I hope you enjoy watching.
Good afternoon, Michael, and thanks for being with us again.
Good afternoon, Carlo and Paolo. Thanks for inviting me again.
For being with us. I wanted to start with the first question about today's topic, which is the contentious issue of the tariff escalation started by Donald Trump the 3rd of April of this year. For over a week, we've heard Western commentators claiming that it was nothing but a crazy move without any rationality. And similarly, the decision of suspending the tariff for 90 days was seen as nothing but a massive U-turn. And even though some truth might, lie in these arguments, I wanted to ask you if you agreed with this reading, or if you see this move as part of an overall strategy that, despite being risky, might actually be part of an overall gamble with which the US are trying to force a major restructuring of the international economic and monetary system, possibly similar to the ones applied by Nixon in 71 or by Reagan in 85 with the Plaza agreements.
Yes, well, I think there is a lot of truth in the madness that we've seen over the last few weeks. With one moment we get a set of tariffs with different ones for different countries. And then we're announced on Liberation Day, in the 2nd of April, Donald Trump announces what he calls reciprocal tariffs, so that it's supposed to match the tariffs being imposed upon US exports by other countries. Actually, when the madness of it is revealed by the actual technical calculation for these tariffs, which was quite ludicrous. It wasn't based on anything to do with what other countries' tariffs were or their non-tariff and other measures of quotas and other ways in which they might restrict exports into their country. It was based on some sort of mathematical calculation worked out by his advisors, so that we had a ludicrous situation, for example, where every country in the world got a tariff, whether they had a surplus of exports with the US or not. And in the case, of course, of the Heard and McDonald Islands, there are just penguins there. And unfortunately, apart from guano, they haven't really got anything to export and haven't been exporting, according to the government of the penguins there, to the US. So we have this ludicrously mad idea of tariff processes going on. Not only that, but having announced them, within days, he causes a pause, removes them, but also doubles up on the tariffs for China in retaliation to China's reaction to the original set of tariffs. And then he says that, well, actually, it's not all the tariffs on China. All those exports coming out of China by American companies, consumer electronics from Apple and so on, they'll now be exempt from tariffs and so on. But then immediately after that says that it's only a temporary exemption, and down the road we're going to have some more tariffs on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. So you see, having made all those points to you, it is totally confusing and creates huge uncertainty, not only in financial markets, which went up and down on this news all the time, but also in what Donald likes to call Main Street, that is the manufacturing and real services sector of the US economy. Companies just don't know what this means. And of course, countries around the world don't know where this is going to fall upon them over the future. So this is a mad and uncertain situation, which is clearly not resolved yet. The tariff war is going to continue. But within this madness, to use Shakespeare's term, there is method, I think. There is some method in this madness. It's not just something. A lot of the mainstream economists just call it mad and rule out tariffs, but they're not really recognizing, I think they ought to recognize that, and it's been presented by Trump and his advisors, what the purpose is underneath all this confusion and mess. In my view, the aim of Trump and the administration and this wing of the ruling groups in the United States is that they see the rest of the world has stolen the US's control of the economy on the world scale, and it's taken a bigger share away from them. And this is particularly the case when we look at manufacturing. The US used to be the manufacturing power of the world after the Second World War, but it's lost that position, and particularly lost that position in the last 20 or 30 years. So its jobs have disappeared from US manufacturing altogether. And although US manufacturing is still an important economic group and sector in the US and internationally, it's lost huge ground to China and to the rest of Asia over the last 20 or 30 years. This, apparently, Trump says, is the most important thing. That's got to be altered. Yes, we still control finance. We still control the services sector. We still have better technology on the whole, but all that's becoming disappearing, and in particular, manufacturing is gone. So he wants all the American companies that went away in the 70s and 80s and 90s to use cheap labor in the peripheral countries and in China elsewhere to come back to the US. And this is the purpose of these tariffs. That is the, if you want to put a sort of logical argument for what's behind this. The question we have to ask ourselves is, A, where's this supposed to lead to? And secondly, will it work anyway? Will all these tariffs actually produce this change, this structural change in the world? We can discuss that further. I'll just simply say that given the state of the manufacturing situation economically, globally, I think that ship has passed. There's no way that the US can come back and become the major manufacturing power and that China will be shoved into some secondary status. That can't be reversed. The process has gone too far. So that's going to pose serious problems down the road.
Linking to this, because I think that this emphasis on the importance of reindustrialization is definitely something that also on our Italian channel we have emphasized a lot with Giuliano and other analysts. But together with that, there seems to be another goal, and those two goals are intrinsically contradictory. So on one hand, there seems to be this real desire to reindustrialize the American economy, both for internal political reasons, because ultimately, the electors in the Rust Belt voted him possibly under the impression that he would have favored a reindustrialization of the country. But we reckon also, and especially for geopolitical and military reasons, linked to an hypothetical confrontation with China, because clearly, if you're preparing to a military confrontation, you need to have an industrial power that is not like fading away. However, at the same time, Trump's administration seems determined not to want to lose the dollar as the international currency, and with all the advantages related to the financing of the American debt, attracting foreign capitals to boost the US stock market bubble, and being able to weaponize the dollar as part of US foreign policy. So if for the first objective, it would be better to have a relatively weaker dollar, so to manage a progressive devaluation, not a disordered devaluation, but a progressive devaluation of the dollar. For the latter, so for the finance interests, a strong dollar is key, and expectations of a devaluating currency will surely diminish its attractiveness for both institutional and private investors. So would you agree with this interpretation? Can Trump have his cake and eat it too, as you say in the UK?
Yeah, well, you're right, Carlo. I mean, it's a big contradiction. Is it the best way to gain market share in world manufacturing markets is to be cost effective at home and to be able to sell at a price that is cheaper than your opponents. One of the ways that you can do that against rivals is to devalue your currency. So if you could devalue the dollar, that creates the opportunity for more export sales. I don't think that actually Trump thinks that's the way. He still also wants, in his view, to maintain the dollar as the currency in the world for trade, investment, financial capital flows, and so on. And it's an important economic and political power for the United States to sustain. And so it's a contradiction here. How is this to be resolved? Well, I'm not sure that Trump and his advisors know how it's to be resolved. They've come up with the most ridiculous ideas. They say that the reason there's a balance of payments deficit for the US is because everybody is forced dollars onto the United States by trying to buy up United States assets and so on, creating a deficit at home. This is a ludicrous argument. The whole point of the original development of the dollar dominance in the world was not because it was forced on the Americans by nasty export surplusing countries in Europe and Japan and so on. Quite the opposite was the case, that the dollar was forced on them to maintain international payments control over the activities of Europe, Japan, and of course Asia and China. But so now if they want to say that they want to don't lose that hegemonic position of the dollar, and at the same time they want their manufacturing industry to be completely dominant and competitive against Asia and other countries, then they've got a real problem. Tariffs is not the answer, is it? I mean, how did China become such a great manufacturing superpower? It did it because, yes, starting with cheap labor, that's true, but also through a massive investment into manufacturing sector and the infrastructure that goes around that. And alongside that, also increasingly moving up the value-added ladder, as we say, to more value-added exports and manufactures, to high technology through a planned state-led investment program. Now, is Trump going to introduce a planned state-led investment program to boost technology and manufacturing in the US? I don't think so, because that's in the hands of the private sector. It's up for them to decide where they want to invest. Biden made some attempt in what he called his industrial strategy by providing incentives, tax incentives, to the big pharmaceutical and tech companies, but that hasn't really transformed the position in the manufacturing sector as a whole. And so unless you have a state-led investment program in the US, then they're not going to transform that position. So they're going to be left with a position where there isn't really much change in manufacturing production, despite the tariffs, certainly not in employment. And at the same time, they're risking a decline in the dollar, which they don't want as well as a result. How this is going to be resolved by the Trump administration before they come to midterm elections in 2 years' time remains to be seen. But it's a contradiction that can't be resolved. I mean, I'll finish on this point, Carlo and Paolo, that you mentioned the question of Nixon and you mentioned the question of Reagan and the Plaza Accord. Those were two attempts, in effect, to devalue the dollar, to make it cheaper. The dollar was taken off the gold standard in 1971 by Nixon, and then the dollar declined in value against the gold and against other currencies. In the Plaza Accord, it was made absolutely clear that the yen in particular, but the euro as well, or not the euro then, but the German mark and so on, had to increase in value relative to the dollar so that US manufacturing would be competitive. And that was forced upon Japan. It ruined Japan's economic growth, actually. It was unable to continue on that basis, but it didn't transform US manufacturing. They failed to transform it. The profitability of US manufacturing remained weak, investment remained weak, and they continued to lose ground to somebody they never saw coming, the huge, gigantic China economy. They know about the small Asian ones, which they still had political and economic control over, but China was one that they were unable to, they attempted to, Nixon attempted to, others attempted to bring China into the aegis of American imperialism. China maintained their independence, maintained their position of not having foreign capitalist control in their country, or even capitalist control, and that has been the big issue, and that's the thing that really Trump or Biden or any of the American administrations cannot resolve.
I just want to ask you one more thing, which I'm trying to condense 2 points in one, so hopefully I won't get myself, I hope to be clear. Now, the first one is, so just to think of it as a like the dream of Trump after these 90 days of suspension. So would you agree that his dream would be to have, on one hand, and possibly out of a conception of the role of the US as a massive consumer market, as the bargaining tool to impose this set of conditions, to favor the outsourcing of some of the production lines, especially if high-tech productions, from what ultimately are not going to be allied states anymore, but more and more vassal states towards the US. Again, using this massive potential blackmail, or either you do that, either you convince your industrial main companies to or favor this transition towards the outsourcing in the US, or I will just put ludicrous tariffs against you. And the second point is having an agreement with the governments themselves and the central banks of those governments to keep buying US treasuries, possibly for long durations, like in the Miran report, they even mentioned these 100-year bonds at very low interest rates. So, but isn't this coming out of a perception of the US as possibly something that they aren't anymore? Yes, they are a massive consumer, but are they big enough to force those countries towards this direction? And the other point that I thought about was you were talking is, even assuming that this was the case, possibly wouldn't be enough to solve the problem in the long run, because ultimately, especially if you come from a Marxist perspective, you will say that the problem of the US is in the profitability and the productivity of their economy. So shouldn't they be more concerned about the fact that, for example, in January, China has launched DeepSeek, and not in itself, I mean, I'm not saying that DeepSeek in itself is a game changer, but it's probably signaling that they're losing the game in the sectors that are the ones where rate of profit is likely going to be higher in the future. And that is really what is the key battlefield of the competition between the US and China, not necessarily what happens in the short run with the tariff war. Or maybe I don't know. Hopefully I was clear enough.
Yes, I mean, lots of points there, good ones. The first thing to say is that the reason for the pause, I think we have to remember, is actually Trump backing down. That when they put the reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day, suddenly the markets panicked. The stock market collapsed, particularly for the big American companies' stock prices, but also much more seriously, the treasury market, the bond market for viewers, collapsed, went down very sharply. And that's dangerous because it means interest rates rise fast. It means a lot of people who've been speculating in the bond market and financial assets like hedge funds and other non-banks suddenly found themselves with a load of stock on their balance books which were worth way less. And if they sold them, they'd be in deep trouble. So there was a serious squeeze going to develop. They screamed desperation to the White House, and Trump backed down. He said, "Okay, well, we'll have a pause. We'll have a 90-day pause." That was the initial reason, I think, for that move backwards. But the 90 days is there to use. If you remember that Trump's famous book is that he sold The Art of the Deal. He thinks that I've got 90 days now, and we can put some pressure on all these countries around the world to come up with a nice deal, which we can regard as a victory on the question of tariffs, or they agree maybe to do some investments, allow American investments in the country, or to provide special services to the US in various forms, or reduce certain key tariffs, open up free zones, all kinds of things which the American Trump can claim to be a victory. That's what he's hoping for. He says there are 70 countries on the phone calls talking to him about how to do a deal. Well, he hasn't actually named who these 70 countries are and what they're saying, but what worries me for him, I think, is that there must be another 40 countries who aren't bothering. And so we wonder just which ones they are who are not bothering to contact Trump during this situation. But the deal-making idea, which is so prominent in Trump's way of dealing with economics, is there, I think. So we'll see at the end of the 90 days whether anything comes of this, but I very much doubt it. I mean, as you said, Carlo, the real problem that the Americans have got is that they don't have, they're increasingly losing their technological superiority. As you say, for example, in artificial intelligence, they have the big American companies, OpenAI, all the others, Google, etc., who are producing very expensive artificial intelligence models, which require huge data centers to be built across America, sucking up energy like nobody's business. And then China comes along and said, well, we've just taken the basic ideas that you guys have got. We produced a very good artificial intelligence model. It doesn't cost you anything. You can have it for free. You can see how it works, and you can stick it on a laptop we're all talking on now. You don't need a big data center. And this is an absolute disaster for the big American companies if it becomes a prevalent and general development for artificial intelligence. What, as you say, Carlo, what that implies is that the technological change that's going so fast is that the Americans are fast losing their position to control that situation, to monopolize it, to establish proprietary rights which enable them to control the market. All that's under threat. And it makes China even more of a bogey person as far as the Americans are concerned. If you read everything now, particularly in the last week, everything is China, China, China. It's China. Almost all the other countries and their terrible habits on tariffs have taken a second stage back, because now it's only 10% tariff for everybody else except China. They're the nasty boys. I was even reading in today's paper, it's a general mainstream economics view that yes, it's Trump's mad. He's introduced all his tariffs, but don't forget this is all the fault of China for getting export services, for selling too much, for taking over the market. If China hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have had Trump. This is the sort of backwards argument. You could almost say it's like saying that the reason that Israel is so terrible is because of Palestinians. I mean, it's an argument that's so ludicrous, but nevertheless is an indication of the way they're thinking. So the technological issue is the long-term problem that the Americans have got. And as you point out, they can't resolve that, I don't think, on the basis of a market economy where the profitability of the major companies in that economy are in difficulty. I just say to viewers, it's often said, well, the big Magnificent Seven, as it's called, the Facebook, Nvidia, Tesla, and so on, they make huge profits. So surely American economies, the companies are making huge profits. And if you look at the margins, they are making big profits. But what is forgotten is that there are 30,000 American companies who are hardly making any profit at all. They're really struggling to get those sort of margins and maintain profitability. If we look at the average, the difficulty exists for the American economy. That doesn't apply to some of the other countries, but in particular to those countries like China, which don't have to rely on the profitability of their capitalist sector to expand their economy. And that is a contradiction that cannot be resolved by Trump or any other administration in the US.
Mm-hmm. So if I can get in this point, it seems to me that with your last answer, Michael, you're pointing to a systemic difference between China and let's call it Western economy. Mm-hmm. In that, in the West, it seems that after all, the economy and its big resources are sort of cannibalized by a few actors, by a few players, which somehow manage to somehow, I mean, through lobbying, manage to get their hands in the governments, right? Whereas in China, everything is planned, everything is done starting from a central vision that then directs the various operations of the various sectors, which are left somehow independent in their particular operation, but still directed centrally. So I think what we're seeing is really a new type of confrontation between what styles itself as the economy of the free world and the economy of a socialist country. And to me, it seems that this is showing that in a modern state, which is a highly complex organism, if you will, you need some kind of central direction. Now, attached to this observation, I don't know if you agree with this observation, but attached to this observation, I would like to ask, in your opinion, right now, put under pressure by these tariffs, what kind of instruments does China have to counter these tariffs in such a way that their population, the working class in China, doesn't have to bear the burden of this war, and whether this could in fact turn out to be an opportunity for China to further the development of their internal market by, I don't know, raising salaries or creating conditions whereby even from a market point of view, China will be increasingly independent of exports to America, for example.
Well, I think that's right. I think first of all, just to remind ourselves that China is 1.4 billion people. It's the second largest economy in the world in terms of gross domestic product, if you want to measure it in dollar terms. And if you want to measure it in what they call purchasing power terms, it's even larger than the US. And there are other measurements which suggest it could be even larger than that. But leaving that aside, I think the point to be made here in relation to tariffs is, well, China is a big export economy, it said. Well, okay, yes, it is. And its share of GDP in exports is relatively high compared to a lot of other countries. But when you look at the trade balance, it's only about 2% of GDP. It's quite relatively small. The US is running a deficit of 2.5% to 3% of GDP. China is running a surplus of 2 to 3% of GDP. It's just got record export figures come out today. But the surplus is importing a lot of things, food, raw materials, and so on. So the actual surplus is not that large. So the idea that exports and the trade is absolutely essential to sustain China's economic growth is not correct. In fact, the biggest contribution to China's economic growth over the last 20 or 30 years has been investment domestically in infrastructure, in transport, in energy, in technology. These are domestic investments, not to do with exporting abroad, and also a significant improvement in consumer spending. The urbanization of China over the last 40 years, from being basically a rural country with only 20% in the cities to where it's now 65% in the cities, that urbanization with huge housing expansion, urbanization and so on, has also led to a very sharp increase in the wages, the real wages of the majority of Chinese people. Not all, there's still poor people in the rural provinces, but a big increase in the living standards, an unprecedented, phenomenal increase in living standards over the last 40 years in China. India, with the same population, has not experienced anything like that improvement for the majority of the population. So that's a transformation. So people have spending power to some extent in China, so that creates an internal market, consumer market as well. So when you go to China, they now have electric vehicles. They're the biggest electric vehicle manufacturers in the world. They're selling that abroad in export, but their biggest market is at home. So BYD, which is now the biggest electrical vehicle maker in the world, sells millions of BYD cars in China and around Asia as well. You can see them everywhere. And that is the transformation of a domestic market, which is now in the hands of the Chinese government. So they have, in many ways, in my view, a lot of protection against the idea that tariffs are going to destroy the economy, because they're now a big internal market which they can use. And they have other ways in which they can improve that market. They could, as you say, increase pensions, social security spending, which is relatively low even by peripheral standards, because people used to rely on their jobs and their position in the state sector for their pensions and retirement. That's somewhat changed. That's still too low. They also could just carry out a big fiscal spending program. They've done a lot of infrastructure, but the government's looking to invest and increase spending. It could just hand out checks, which the Americans used to argue was an way of doing that. That's a possibility for doing that if they wish to boost demand. I don't know if they really need to do that, but that is the position in which they have not various options here to avoid the impact of that. Now, what does that mean on the bottom line? Well, Goldman Sachs, which is the big US investment bank, made a measurement of what they thought the impact of the tariffs would be after the reciprocal tariffs were introduced by Trump on Liberation Day. And they reckon that the US was likely to have grown by about 2 to 2.5% this year if there hadn't been this tariff war. They now reckon that the US will lose about 2 percentage points of that growth rate at the current point. So they'll be down to 0.5 or even less for 2025. China is estimated to grow at 4.5 to 5%. Goldman Sachs said that the impact of tariffs will take 0.5 percentage point off the growth rate of China. So if they're growing at 4.5, they'll still be growing at 4 despite these measures. Well, the US will be in a slump, or virtually in a slump, according to Goldman Sachs. And that's not some Marxist left-wing organization. That's the epitome of finance capital presenting this argument. So even they recognize that China is in a much stronger position than you think, than Trump thinks, and a lot of other Western economists think. They think China is going to go down some hole, while the US will gain from this. I think, in many ways, it's the reverse.
Yeah, and linked to this, do you think that the launching of this digital yuan, the digital renminbi, which I've heard is already in operation, at least for the ASEAN countries, for the countries that are part of the, how would I call it, the sort of agreements of the Southeast Asian countries for mutual trade and stuff like that. Do you think that this new tool will, in fact, on the one hand, be a rival to the dollar and hence further the process of de-dollarization, at least in the area here?
Well, digitalizing a currency makes it more efficient. It's easy to make the transactions much more quickly. It saves on costs. So it adds a marginal benefit. And if you've got a system where everybody's participating in the same digital system on one currency, that's going to dramatically improve the ability to make trade and investment decisions and payments and so on, digitally being quicker. So insofar as that becomes adopted, that will obviously add a little bit of help to the idea that there's an independent network of currency system available to countries in Asia or elsewhere that's not in the hands of the dollar system or the euro system for that matter. So to some extent, it will make a difference. But I still think we have to be cautious here that there's sometimes a talk, oh, it's only around the corner now. The BRICS are going to completely take over. We're going to have renminbi as an international currency and the US dollar is finished. I don't think that's the case. This was still a long way to go before we get to that point. The US is still, the dollar is still 70% of international payments. It's still the main trading transaction currency. And it's still the main store of wealth in terms of FX reserves. Most foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Gold is small. Other currencies are very small. So it's still a long way before the grip of the dollar goes. But there's no doubt the digitalization of the currency, whether it's the renminbi or whether it's other currencies, is going to provide some support to that particular currency's payment system over the next period. But it's not decisive.
I understand. And final question, at least for me, going back to Europe, what do you think, for example, a country like Italy in this situation should do? Would be wise to re-establish the kind of linkages that we had established in 2018 under the Conte government with China, with commercial agreements, with collaboration agreements. And linked to this question, in news of the past few days, it seems that South Korea, Japan, and China have agreed on some kind of economic collaboration platform of sorts. I don't know what that is precisely. I wonder whether you knew more about this and what the impact of these three nations collaborating, even just economically, could be.
Well, on Italy and Europe for that matter, I think I've heard some Western commentators saying that Europe's got to choose between the US and China. Now, my reply to that is I don't think Europe should choose between those two. Europe, or Italy for that matter, must develop their own independent economic policy, which is going to benefit the people of their country or of the region as a whole. And it's not a question of choosing between the two other great economic powers, if you like, which is the problem that the European leaders have at the moment. They're completely unable to come up with any independent, not only foreign policy, clearly not, but even economic policy that will actually lead to the position where European citizens will see an improvement in their condition and the economies will come out of virtual stagnation to some sort of development of employment and technology. And as we know, Italy has basically been in stagnation for really decades. Yes. Its productivity growth rate is virtually non-existent. I mean, we're only us in the UK can now compete with an even worse one in the last few years. But Italy has had a long-standing position in that position. It's not really been able to take the economy forward. It's not been able to therefore raise living standards to anything to the extent that we've seen in some of the northern parts of Europe, at least in the last 20 years. Of course, they're in trouble now as well. So there has to be a serious national policy of investment and planning, and that requires bringing together the industries and the economic sectors of Italy into a plan that's publicly owned, in my view, that can lay the basis for, if they want them to choose, they should go to close to the model of the Chinese economy, not necessarily choosing China, rather than the model of the consumer-led market financial disaster that they can see across the Atlantic pond. That's what they have to work on. They have to come up with a policy that really meets Italian needs, people's needs in that direction, and not say, well, is it better to join Belt and Road, or is it better to stay in the transatlantic community agreement or whatever, or sign, like our British politicians are talking about signing a trade agreement with the US as a solution. I mean, this is pathetic. Apart from the fact that such a trade agreement will only benefit the US rather than the UK, it's not providing an independent way forward for the British people and the British economy. The same applies to Italy, in my view.
I see. So back to the primacy of politics, basically. We should go back to the primacy of politics.
Yeah. We need to, it's not a nationalist position. This is saying that, it's Italian people a policy which meets Italy's national needs and the economy, linked cooperatively, of course, with the rest of Europe as well, but not to stand by and hoping that some sort of economic missile from either China or the US is going to solve their problem or make it worse, coming over their heads.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, for as much as it counts, I totally agree with what Michael just said. I think that it's not a nationalist position, it's a pragmatic position. If anything, is taking back control of our sovereignty and considering that what is said is to retake ownership of basically the basic premises of an industrial policy that even under the Christian democratic government of the First Republic in Italy was kind of like a fait accompli. It was an obvious reality, and now we have just decided to give up on it and to, I mean, ultimately we live in a European Union in which Germany, that benefited from cheap gas from Russia, didn't say a word about the Nord Stream being attacked by God knows whom, but definitely not by the Russians. So in terms of the incapacity of this ruling class to represent the interest of the working people, of the common people of Europe, I think this is nothing but a national, and if anything, it's only if the left doesn't stand for the interest of the common people that then some fake populist sovereign parties
I would add, all we have as for an industrial policy in Europe is arms spending. Let's boost the arms expenditure. Let's get the arms manufacturers to build up our armed forces because, Russia's going to be in our streets tomorrow. This line is the only thing they're offering in an industrial policy. For that matter, it's the same thing as Trump. Trump has said that he's going to cut all civil spending, government spending, public services, cut taxes for the corporations using tariff money, which won't be anywhere near enough. But the one thing he's not cutting is arms spending. He's just announced $1 trillion a year budget on arms. So all these countries in the Western imperialist bloc are looking to solve their issues by arms spending for whatever spurious reason they can come up with. All I can say as an economist, a Marxist economist, arms spending may provide arms manufacturers with a lot of profit, and that's a relatively small part of the capitalist economy, but it doesn't help the wider capitalist economy because sources are sucked into arms, which is unproductive. I'm sure the viewers recognize that you can't eat a tank, and a tank doesn't produce anything else but destroy things. So it's not going to be a productive way of taking an economy forward. It's actually going to be detrimental to an economy over time. In the short term, maybe a few big manufacturers can make money, but that's not a solution. And that's all that's being offered in Europe and in the United States. I forgot to mention the question that Paolo raised about Japan and Asia and China coming together. What I think the implication here is, the Americans are telling Japanese to build more arms, take American manufacturers to surround China. I think the Japanese, to some extent, are recognizing that this is a futile thing to do. That they live not very far away from a huge economy with a huge population, which is quite capable of defending itself and probably destroying Japan in minutes if it wanted to. So they have to look at a different way of handling the situation. It's the same question with Italy. They need an independent policy, not one that depends upon deciding whether they should be part of the American alliance or with China.
Besides, regarding this thing of rearming, I think that once Japan and Germany will be rearmed, even if under the premises that the Americans are going to control them, this thing of controlling two belligerent nations that have showed time and again in their history of being capable of waging terrible wars, it's a dream. It's a dream. I'm really curious to see how the Americans are going to control the proud samurai and the and the German tribesmen. I'm really curious to see that. So,
well, maybe we can leave the topic of military Keynesianism for another time, because Michael also wrote a very interesting article on that. But then obviously Trump stole the scene by doing tariff stuff, so we had to talk about that.
Well, he's a good showman. He always does that.
Well, we had one similar to him in Italy, so we are kind of used to this type of.
It's passed on.
Yes. We miss him a little bit. No, I'm joking, but sometimes, No, anyway, I think what Michael said in terms of the political implications, I think really resonate with what Ottolina is trying to do in Italy. So to build up a popular movement that, from a left perspective, takes back ownership of the sovereignty of our state, to shift our economic system in a socialist sense. And I think that never like today, you could go back to the Luxembourg dichotomy. Either is going to be a socialist transformation and an economy of cooperation between peoples, and states in the world, or really like the prospects of a barbarism are looking more and more likely. So let's hope that it's going to be.
I'm just completing a new book which will be out at the end of this year or early next year, and the title of that book is "Time is Running Out." And it presents exactly the point that you're making, that we're not being apocalyptic now. It's not too late to change the world for better, but time is running out.
Indeed.
All right. On this slightly optimistic note, we need to have the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will.
Yes.
I think we can stop our conversation here, and thank you a lot for another fantastic interview.
Thank you very much.
It seems that in the midst of this uncertainty, some opportunities open up for countries that genuinely try to regain sovereign control of their economic policy and international alignments. Contrary to a view of international relations that imposes a strict confrontation between quickly tightening blocs, we claim that there is an opportunity to reshape foreign policy in the direction of a genuine multipolarity and dialogue, including China and Russia. Equally, there is the opportunity to use this paradigm crisis as a way to promote a shift also in internal economic policy towards a new protagonism of the state and the pursuit of policies inspired by socialist goals. If you want to hear more about how we are trying to unite and interpret the world so that we can change it, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. You may also want to support our work by joining our founding campaign at the links in the description below. We are an Italian-based collective of journalists, activists, philosophers, and artists whose goal is to build a media for the 99%. I'm Diego, and once again, this is 99 Media. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.